history does not fade. It merely learns to hide behind the noise of the modern world, waiting in the dark spaces between what was recorded and what was lost, patient in a way that nothing living can afford to be. There are words carved into stone, and words pressed into wet clay, and words inked onto papyrus fine as a moth's wing that have outlasted the empires that produced them, the languages that once gave them sound, and the very gods they were written to placate. And some of these words, when finally translated after thousands of years of silence, do not offer comfort. They do not explain. They unsettle. They describe things half-glimpsed, threats without names, punishments without crimes, and a darkness that the ancient Egyptians themselves, a people who mapped the architecture of the afterlife with obsessive meticulous care, seemed unwilling or unable to fully describe. We are going to spend the next several hours in that unsettled space, the narrow, uncertain ground between what has survived and what can actually be understood. We are going to move slowly through tombs and temple walls, through fragile papyrus and broken stelae, through the specific catalogued unease of professional Egyptology, a discipline built on translating a civilization that often seems to have translated itself only partway, leaving the rest deliberately, permanently obscured. Picture, for a moment, the Valley of the Kings in the last hour before sunset, when the heat of the day finally begins to loosen its grip on the pale limestone cliffs, and the shadows pool first in the low places, in the mouths of the tomb entrances themselves. Dark rectangular openings cut into rock the color of old bone. The tourists have mostly gone by this hour, shepherded back toward the buses waiting near the visitor center, and what remains is a kind of held stillness, the wind moving faintly through the wadi, carrying with it the fine dry dust that has settled over this valley for more than 3,000 years. The cliffs themselves show the fractures of that immense span of time quite openly, deep vertical cracks where the desert heat has expanded and contracted the stone across countless 1,000-degree days and near-freezing nights, until the rock face looks almost like something that has been slowly, patiently breaking apart in extreme slow motion, a fracture pattern that will not resolve itself for another several thousand years if it resolves at all. Loose scree gathers at the base of the cliffs in pale drifts, and here and there, a modern metal railing, rusted at the joints, marks the entrance to a tomb that a team of archaeologists spent a full season carefully excavating, only to find at its deepest chamber walls covered in texts that remain in places genuinely unagreed upon even now, translated differently by different scholars, their true meaning caught somewhere between certainty and educated guesswork. Inside those tombs, where electric lighting has replaced the oil lamps and torches of the original builders, the air carries a specific mineral coolness, a temperature that barely shifts regardless of the season outside, and a silence that feels less like an absence of sound and more like a held breath, thick with the particular density of enclosed stone. The paint on the walls in the best-preserved chambers remains almost shockingly vivid, ochre and lapis blue, and a deep oxidized red, applied by artisans working from a canon of religious imagery so specific, so codified, that its exact rules survive today in considerably more detail than the actual beliefs those rules were meant to express. This is the peculiar and enduring frustration at the center of Egyptology, a discipline that possesses, in raw physical terms, an almost unimaginable abundance of evidence. We have the tombs themselves intact in places no other ancient civilization can rival. We have hundreds of thousands of individual objects, cataloged and stored in museum basements across the world, far more than any team of researchers could hope to fully study in several lifetimes. We have walls of hieroglyphic text stretching across entire temple complexes, and papyrus scrolls unrolled with excruciating care in conservation laboratories and ostraca, those humble broken shards of pottery used for everyday writing, bearing the casual, offhand comments of workers who lived and died more than 3,000 years before the invention of the printing press. And yet, standing in front of all of this material abundance, the modern researcher frequently finds herself facing a wall of interpretive silence just as vast as the physical record is rich. The Egyptians wrote extensively about the mechanics of the afterlife, about the correct incantations to speak before this god or that guardian, about the precise ritual actions required to ensure a smooth passage through the underworld. What they wrote considerably less about, what they seemed almost systematically unwilling to record, were the plain explanatory details a modern reader instinctively craves. The specific historical events that inspired certain texts, the actual lived experience behind certain terrifying warnings, the honest, unguarded reasoning behind rituals that, on their surface, describe punishments and entities of a genuinely disturbing character. This is the tension we will sit inside for the length of this documentary. We are, in the most literal sense, extraordinarily close to these people. Their handwriting survives. Their fingerprints remain pressed into unfired clay seals. Their words can, in many cases, still be read today, precisely as they were written, symbol by symbol. And yet the actual interior world that produced those words, the fear, the theology, the specific historical anxieties that gave rise to some of the most unsettling texts in the ancient world, remains locked beneath layers of historical silence that 4 centuries of dedicated scholarship have only partially pried open. We begin now with the oldest and perhaps the most startling of these texts, carved not into the tomb of a common person, nor even a high official, but into the innermost burial chamber of a king. At Saqqara, beneath a pyramid built for a king named Unas, the last ruler of Egypt's 5th dynasty, there is a burial chamber whose walls are covered, floor to ceiling, in a dense field of hieroglyphic text, painted a deep, unfaded blue-green, the color chosen deliberately to evoke the primordial waters from which the Egyptians believed all creation had first emerged. This is the earliest known appearance of what scholars now call the pyramid texts, the oldest substantial body of religious writing to survive from anywhere on Earth, older than the pyramids of Giza's neighboring monuments feel, older by centuries than anything comparable from Mesopotamia, a set of spells meant to be spoken on behalf of the dead king, to guide him upward, out of his tomb, into the company of the stars and the sun. Among these spells, carved into the western gable of the antechamber, is a passage that modern Egyptologists have come to call, with a certain grim informality, the Cannibal hymn. It describes the dead king not ascending gently into the heavens on the strength of ritual purity, but hunting the gods themselves, across the sky, capturing them and consuming them, their organs boiled in great pots for his meal, their magic and their power absorbed directly into his own being through the act of eating them. The text does not shy away from anatomical specificity. It speaks of the king's servants slaughtering the gods for his kitchen, of the oldest deities providing his breakfast, the middle-aged ones his lunch, the youngest his evening meal, until the king has consumed the totality of divine power and become, in the language of the text itself, something greater than any single god, a being who has eaten magic itself and digested it into his own substance. Egyptologists have never fully agreed on what to make of this. The dominant interpretation holds that the passage represents a kind of extreme theological metaphor, an image of total spiritual absorption expressed through the most visceral language its authors could summon, meant to convey the king's total supremacy over the divine order rather than any literal ritual practice. But the specificity of the imagery, the careful enumeration of body parts, the domestic, almost bureaucratic language used to describe the preparation of a meal from divine flesh, unsettles many who encounter it precisely because it reads less like abstract metaphor and more like a detailed procedural account, written by people who understood exactly what conceptual work they were describing, even if the physical practice it describes never took literal form. The unsettling nature of the hymn is compounded by its placement. This is not a marginal text, tucked into some obscure corner of Egyptian religious literature. It sits at the very heart of the oldest surviving royal funerary program, a text meant to be spoken, or perhaps simply read silently by the king's spirit in the deepest, most sacred chamber of his tomb, at the exact threshold between death and the promised eternal life beyond it. Whatever fear or awe this text was meant to address, whatever specific anxiety about power, mortality, and divine order it was written to answer, the Egyptians themselves left no accompanying commentary to explain it. We have the words, we do not have the reasoning. Several centuries after Unas was laid to rest with the Cannibal hymn sealed around him, a very different but equally unsettling category of text begins appearing in the Egyptian archaeological record, this time not in the tombs of kings, but buried in pits, smashed deliberately, and left in the ground as part of a ritual whose precise mechanics survive with unusual clarity, even while its full emotional and political context remains genuinely debated. These are the execration texts, inscribed most often onto small clay figurines shaped crudely into the form of bound captives, or onto the fragments of pottery bowls, and they consist of lists, methodical and exhaustive, of the names of Egypt's enemies, foreign rulers, rebellious officials, and in some cases simply the abstract, generalized threats an ancient Egyptian mind associated with chaos and disorder itself. Each name was inscribed with a formulaic curse attached, invoking suffering, defeat, and death upon the named individual or people, before the object bearing the inscription was ritually smashed, often by being thrown to the ground or struck with a mallet and buried, sometimes near a cemetery, sometimes near a royal building, as though the physical destruction of the object were understood to directly cause the destruction of the person it named. What unsettles modern researchers about these texts is not merely their content, which is straightforward enough in its intent, but the sheer administrative thoroughness with which the ritual was apparently conducted. Archaeologists have recovered caches containing hundreds of individual figurines and fragments, each one carefully inscribed with a distinct name, organized in some cases by geographic region, suggesting a bureaucratic apparatus dedicated specifically to the ongoing systematic cursing of Egypt's perceived enemies, updated periodically as political circumstances shifted, discarded and replaced as old threats faded and new ones emerged. This was not, in other words, a single dramatic ritual performed once in a moment of crisis. It appears to have been an institutionalized practice, conducted routinely, with the same careful record-keeping the Egyptian state applied to grain shipments and tax assessments. The genuine unease many feel encountering these texts comes from precisely this combination, the mundane procedural tone of state bureaucracy applied to something so nakedly aggressive, a ritual technology of harm, refined and repeated across generations, leaving behind, in the smashed clay fragments recovered from these ancient pits, a physical record of intention that requires no interpretation at all. We know exactly what these objects were for. What we do not know, in most individual cases, is whether the harm they wished for ever specifically arrived, whether the named individuals ever learned of the curse laid against them, or whether, in the quiet, unrecorded spaces of Egyptian political life, these rituals functioned less as genuine magical practice and more as a kind of psychological theater, performed by a state that needed, periodically, to enact its own power over the threats it could not always control through more conventional means. By the time of Egypt's New Kingdom, roughly 1,000 years after Unas was sealed into his pyramid at Saqqara, the loose collection of funerary spells that scholars had inherited from the pyramid texts and their successors, the coffin texts, had evolved into a more standardized, more widely distributed body of writing that modern audiences know by the somewhat misleading title, The Book of the Dead, a name applied by 19th century Egyptologists rather than by the Egyptians themselves, who referred to these collections more precisely as the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Among the roughly 200 individual spells that circulated within this tradition, one in particular has drawn sustained, uneasy attention from generations of scholars. Spell 125, The Weighing of the Heart. In this scene, rendered in exquisite, careful detail on papyrus after papyrus recovered from tombs across Egypt, the deceased stands before a great scale, their heart placed on one side of the balance, a single ostrich feather, representing the goddess Mayat and the concept of cosmic truth and order, placed on the other. The god Anubis oversees the weighing, the god Thoth records the result, and crouched beside the scale, waiting, is a creature the Egyptians called Ammit, rendered with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. A composite predator assembled, quite deliberately, from the three animals ancient Egyptians most genuinely feared in the natural world around them. Should the heart prove heavier than the feather, weighed down by a lifetime of wrongdoing the deceased could not adequately account for in the accompanying declarations of innocence, the text describes, without any softening of its language, that Ammit devours the heart on the spot. And this is where the text's silence becomes, in its own way, more unsettling than any explicit description could have been. The Egyptians, so meticulous in describing the geography of the underworld, so careful in cataloging the names of dozens of specific demons and guardians one might encounter along the journey, offer almost nothing about what happens to a person after this particular failure. There is no further chapter. There is no described punishment, no extended underworld imprisonment, no eventual redemption. The text simply moves on, as though this outcome, once reached, required no further elaboration, a kind of narrative silence that scholars have come to interpret as representing total, absolute annihilation, the complete erasure of a person's identity and continued existence, a fate the Egyptians apparently considered too final, or perhaps too genuinely dreadful, to describe in any greater detail. This absence sits at odds with everything else we know about Egyptian funerary literature, which was, in nearly every other respect, obsessively thorough, cataloging the names of 42 divine judges a person had to individually address, listing the specific incantations required to pass each gate of the underworld, providing detailed maps, quite literally illustrated maps, of the topography of the afterlife journey. And yet on the single most consequential outcome in the entire system, the complete failure of judgment, the sources fall almost entirely silent, leaving modern readers with a description of the threat Ammit crouched and waiting, jaws described in vivid anatomical detail, but no description whatsoever of what her devouring of a soul actually meant for the person it happened to, no theology of that particular oblivion, only the crouching, patient shape of the creature herself, rendered again and again across 1,000 years of Egyptian religious art, always waiting, always described in the present tense, as though her hunger were simply a permanent unchanging feature of the cosmic order, requiring no further comment. Inscribed on the golden shrines found within the tomb of Tutankhamun and appearing in various forms in several other royal tombs of the New Kingdom, is a text that scholars have come to call the Book of the Heavenly Cow, and it stands apart from most other Egyptian religious literature in a specific and troubling way. It is, in essence, a myth about a god who nearly destroys all of humanity, told with a directness that many other traditions of divine violence in the ancient world tend to soften or explain away. The text describes the sun god Ra, grown old and weary, learning that humanity has begun plotting against him, whispering rebellion in the quiet corners of the world he created. In response, Ra summons the goddess Hathor in her fierce aspect as the lioness Sekhmet, and sends her down to earth to punish humanity for its disloyalty. What follows is described with an almost clinical brevity that contrasts sharply with the violence of its content. Sekhmet wades through the people of Egypt, and the text states plainly that she waded in their blood, beginning at a place called Heracleopolis, and continuing southward, apparently without any built-in limit to her rampage, until it becomes clear, even to Ra himself, watching from above, that she intends to continue until every human being on Earth has been destroyed. Ra's solution, when it arrives, is described with a strange, almost domestic practicality. He orders that a vast quantity of beer be dyed red to resemble blood and poured across the fields in Sekhmet's path. She drinks it, mistaking it for the blood of her victims, becomes intoxicated, and falls asleep before her rampage can be completed. Waking later, the text implies in her gentler aspect it's Hathor, the violence apparently forgotten, or at least no longer pursued. Humanity survives, but only barely, and only through what reads, on careful examination, less like a triumphant rescue and more like a fortunate accident, a near catastrophe halted by intoxication rather than mercy or justice. What unsettles careful readers of this text is not merely its content, a supreme god nearly annihilating the human race out of wounded pride, but the fact that it appears to have been treated, within Egyptian religious practice, less as a cautionary myth and more as an accepted, foundational piece of cosmic history, referenced in later texts and incorporated into royal funerary programs, without any accompanying effort to soften or reinterpret its implications. The Egyptians, in other words, appear to have simply accepted, as a basic fact about the structure of their universe, that the God who sustained all life had once come within a hair's breadth of ending it entirely, for reasons that, even within the text itself, remain frustratingly vague: an undefined plot, an unspecified rebellion, mentioned only in passing before the violence begins, as though the precise nature of humanity's offense mattered considerably less than the terrifying scale of the response it provoked. Preserved most completely in a papyrus now held in the British Museum, known to scholars as the Bremner Rhine Papyrus, is a collection of ritual texts and accompanying instructions dedicated entirely to the ongoing nightly defeat of a being the Egyptians called Apophis, a vast serpent understood to dwell in the deepest waters of the underworld, whose singular purpose was the total unmaking of creation itself. Apophis does not appear in Egyptian cosmology as a rival god competing for power or territory, in the way Seth, for instance, competes with Horus across a body of mythology filled with grievance and eventual reconciliation. Apophis exists, in nearly every surviving reference to him, purely as negation, an embodiment of non-existence attempting, every single night, to swallow the sun before it can complete its journey through the underworld, and rise again at dawn. The texts describe him in language that avoids almost any of the anthropomorphizing detail the Egyptians typically applied even to their most fearsome demons. He has no recorded parentage, no court, no desires beyond the singular, endlessly repeated attempt to end the sun's journey, and with it, the ordered structure of time and existence itself. The ritual instructions accompanying these texts are remarkably specific, describing how priests were to construct a wax effigy of the serpent, bind it, spit upon it, and burn it in a fire built specifically for the purpose, while reciting a lengthy sequence of curses that name and condemn every aspect of the serpent's being, his flesh, his bones, his very name, which the texts insist must be spoken only in order to be destroyed, never in any context that might grant it further power. This ritual, according to the accompanying instructions, was not a one-time event performed in response to some particular crisis. It was meant to be repeated daily, and especially intensified during specific calendrical periods the Egyptians associated with heightened cosmic vulnerability, a perpetual, institutionalized defense against an enemy that could apparently never be permanently defeated, only endlessly, exhaustingly held at bay. What troubles modern readers of this material is the sheer scale of ongoing anxiety it implies. A civilization that built some of the most confident monumental architecture in human history, that projected in nearly every other surviving text a worldview of stability, order, and cosmic assurance, apparently maintaining in parallel an unbroken generational ritual practice dedicated to fending off total cosmic annihilation on a nightly basis. The temple priests conducting these rituals were not addressing a hypothetical or a distant mythological threat. The texts treat Apophis's nightly assault as an ongoing active reality requiring constant vigilance, constant renewed ritual combat, a war that had apparently been underway since the very beginning of time, and would, by the text's own logic, continue without any final resolution for as long as the sun continued to rise. Egyptologists have long debated what specific historical anxieties, invasion, plague, the simple universal human fear of entropy and dissolution, might have given rise to such a thoroughly institutionalized practice of cosmic dread. But the texts themselves, characteristically, offer no explanation beyond the bare, repeated assertion of the threat itself. Not all of the unsettling texts to survive from ancient Egypt concern gods and monsters. Some of the most genuinely disturbing material comes instead from a small category of literature describing, in the voice of a human narrator, the total collapse of the ordered world the Egyptians called Ma'at, and among these, the text known as the Admonitions of Epur stands as perhaps the most sustained and vivid. Surviving in a single papyrus copy, itself created centuries after the events it purports to describe, the text presents itself as the lament of a man named Epur, addressing an unnamed king, describing a period of total societal breakdown in language of remarkable, almost unbearable specificity. The Nile, he says, has turned to blood. The poor have become wealthy, and the wealthy have been reduced to poverty and desperation. Tombs have been broken open and looted, the dead pulled from their careful preparations for eternity and left exposed. Children of nobles have been dashed against walls. The social order has inverted itself so completely that the text describes servants giving orders to their former masters, and the dead, in one particularly haunting passage, being thrown into the river for lack of proper burial, a fate the Egyptians considered among the very worst that could befall a human being. The total denial of the elaborate funerary preparation their entire religious system was built around. Egyptologists remain genuinely divided about what this text represents. Some scholars have connected it to a specific, documented period of Egyptian history, the collapse of centralized authority following the Old Kingdom, sometimes called the First Intermediate Period, when regional governors known as nomarchs assumed increasing independent power. The state apparently fractured for a period of roughly a century and a half. Other scholars argue that the text is not a historical account at all, but a literary and rhetorical exercise composed considerably later, during the Middle Kingdom, as a kind of cautionary meditation on the fragility of order, designed specifically to celebrate, by dark contrast, the stability of the ruling dynasty under which it was actually written. What makes the text genuinely unsettling, regardless of which historical reading one accepts, is the sheer visceral specificity of its imagery, details that feel less like abstract literary invention and more like the fragmented, traumatized testimony of someone who witnessed genuine catastrophe and struggled, across the text's considerable length, to fully organize that witnessing into coherent narrative. The text circles back repeatedly to the same handful of images: blood in the river, the violated dead, the inverted social order, in a way that reads less like careful literary construction and more like the recursive, obsessive quality of genuine trauma, unable to move past the moment of rupture toward any resolution. And crucially, the text itself never definitively resolves. It ends, in the single surviving copy, without any clear restoration of order, without any triumphant return of stability, simply trailing off into a fragmentary, damaged final section that scholars have never been able to fully reconstruct, leaving modern readers suspended, much as its original audience may have been, in the unresolved aftermath of a catastrophe whose full shape and true historical reality remain, after more than a century of dedicated study, still genuinely uncertain. Among the more intimate and, in their own way, more disquieting documents to survive from ancient Egypt are a small but significant collection of letters, written not between the living, but from the living to the dead, inscribed on bowls, on linen, and on papyrus, and left deliberately in tombs, where it was believed the deceased could somehow still perceive and respond to their contents. These letters, spanning several centuries and recovered from sites across Egypt, address deceased spouses, parents, and children with a directness that feels startlingly modern despite the vast gulf of time separating us from their authors. A widow writes to her dead husband, asking why he has allowed illness to befall her, listing in specific and pointed detail every act of devotion she performed for him while he lived, and demanding, in language that carries an unmistakable undertone of accusation, that he intervene on her behalf among the spirits of the underworld to correct whatever imbalance has caused her current suffering. A man writes to his deceased father, complaining that a household servant has been mistreating the family since the father's death, and asking the dead man to appear to the offending servant in a dream, to frighten them into better behavior. What unsettles modern readers of these texts is the specific theological assumption embedded within nearly all of them, that the dead were understood not as passive recipients of memory and mourning, but as active, potentially dangerous agents, capable of causing illness, misfortune, and suffering among the living, whether through deliberate malice, simple neglect, or a kind of ambient spiritual influence the Egyptians seem to have taken as an unquestioned feature of the world. The letters are frequently written not merely to request help, but to plead, sometimes with an edge of genuine desperation, for the dead to stop causing harm, implying a widespread, culturally accepted belief that the recently deceased were, in some meaningful sense, responsible for a considerable portion of the misfortune, illness, and bad luck experienced by their surviving relatives. This raises a question the surviving texts never directly answer: what specific mechanism was believed to govern this influence? Were the dead understood to act with full conscious intention, nursing grievances from beyond the grave in the same manner they might have while alive? Or was their influence understood as something more diffuse and impersonal, a kind of spiritual radiation emanating from the unquiet, improperly settled dead, requiring no malice at all, simply the unfortunate proximity of the living to a disturbance in the natural order that death itself was supposed to resolve? The letters offer only the practical response to this uncertainty, repeated across generations, appeals, bargains, and occasionally outright demands directed toward the silent, unresponsive dead, whose actual perspective on these accusations, whatever it might have been, has left no trace in the historical record at all. On the western bank of the Nile, in a small walled village now called Deir el-Medina, once lived the specialized community of artisans, scribes, and laborers responsible for excavating and decorating the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings across several centuries of the New Kingdom. Because these workers were literate, and because the dry desert conditions surrounding their village preserved organic material with extraordinary fidelity, archaeologists have recovered an unusually intimate archive of everyday writing from this community. Thousands of ostraca, broken pottery shards, and limestone flakes used as a cheap, disposable writing surface for messages, receipts, legal complaints, and personal notes that were never intended to survive for posterity, let alone for the scrutiny of researchers 3,000 years removed from their authors. Among this vast trove of mundane record-keeping, a smaller subset of texts stands out for the specific, unresolved anxiety they reveal. Several ostraca describe encounters with what their authors call aku, a term generally translated as spirits or the transfigured dead, entities understood to move through the village at night, capable of causing illness, nightmares, and general misfortune among the living. One particularly well-studied text describes a man seeking the intervention of a local wise woman, believed to have particular skill in identifying which specific deceased individual was responsible for troubling a household, so that appropriate offerings might be made to placate them. Other texts describe the use of protective amulets and spoken formulas specifically designed to ward off these nighttime disturbances, suggesting a genuinely widespread, everyday concern among ordinary working Egyptians, considerably removed from the elite theological literature of temple and tomb, about the porous, uncertain boundary between the world of the living and the restless world of the dead. What deepens the unease surrounding these texts is their sheer ordinariness. These were not high priests engaged in elaborate state ritual, addressing cosmic threats to the sun's nightly journey. These were carpenters, plasterers, and scribes, worried, in language stripped of grand theological framing, about disturbances in their own homes, about restless sleep, about unexplained illness in a child or a spouse, attributed without apparent hesitation to the active, ongoing influence of the dead. The casualness with which these concerns appear alongside receipts for grain and complaints about unpaid wages suggests that, for the ordinary residents of this village, the presence of unquiet spirits was not an exceptional crisis requiring extraordinary explanation, but a background feature of daily life, as unremarkable and as genuinely troubling as any other persistent, unresolved household difficulty. Some of the most unsettling absences in the entire Egyptian historical record concern not what was written, but what was deliberately, systematically erased. And nowhere is this erasure more thorough, or more genuinely strange than in the case of the pharaoh Akhenaten and the brief, radical religious revolution he attempted to impose upon Egypt in the middle years of the 14th century before the Common Era. For a period of perhaps 17 years, Akhenaten abandoned the vast ancient pantheon of Egyptian gods in favor of the exclusive worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented not in traditional anthropomorphic form but as a simple solar disk, its rays extending downward and ending in small hands that touch and bless the royal family below. He built an entirely new capital city, Akhetaten, on a stretch of previously uninhabited desert now called Amarna, constructed with startling speed and abandoned almost as quickly following his death. When the traditional priesthood and the traditional gods were restored, and a systematic campaign began to erase Akhenaten's name, his monuments, and his religious innovations from the historical record as thoroughly as the resources of the Egyptian in-state could manage. His name was chiseled from inscriptions wherever it could be found. His monuments were dismantled, the individual stone blocks reused as filler material in later construction projects, where thousands of them remain embedded today, discovered only when later buildings were themselves excavated and dismantled by modern archaeologists. Later Egyptian king lists simply omit him entirely, moving directly from his father to his eventual successors as though the intervening years and the man who ruled them had never existed at all. This was not passive forgetting. It was an active, resourced, sustained campaign of erasure conducted across decades by a state that clearly considered Akhenaten's religious experiment not merely mistaken but genuinely dangerous, requiring the kind of thorough, deliberate unmaking usually reserved for Egypt's most hated foreign enemies. What makes this erasure so unsettling to modern researchers is precisely how effective it very nearly was. Were it not for the accidental survival of the Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence discovered by chance in the ruins of the abandoned capital, and the eventual, painstaking archaeological excavation of the city itself, we would know remarkably little about this entire episode, a period during which the fundamental religious structure of one of history's most enduring civilizations was violently upended and then just as violently restored, all within the span of a single generation. The texts that do survive from Akhenaten's own reign, the hymns to the Aten, the correspondence with foreign rulers, describe a genuinely coherent, even sophisticated theological vision. And yet the silence that followed his death is so complete, so carefully engineered, that we are left with almost no Egyptian account whatsoever of how his own people actually experienced this period, whether as genuine spiritual awakening, as bewildering imposition, or as a trauma so significant that the only appropriate response, once the opportunity arose, was total, deliberate forgetting. Among the works of fiction to survive from ancient Egypt, composed considerably later than most of the material we have discussed so far during the Ptolemaic period, when Egypt had already come under Greek influence following the conquests of Alexander, is a narrative modern scholars call the Tale of Setna Kaimwaz, and it stands as one of the earliest surviving stories in world literature to treat the pursuit of forbidden ancient knowledge as a genuinely dangerous undertaking, a theme that would echo, thousands of years later, through an entirely different tradition of storytelling. The tale follows Setna, a scholarly prince obsessed with acquiring a legendary text called the Book of Thoth, said to contain magic powerful enough to let its reader understand the speech of animals and command the very forces of nature. Setna learns that this book lies buried in the tomb of a long-dead prince named Naneferkaptah, and, ignoring warnings about the tomb's guardians, breaks in to retrieve it. What he finds there is not merely a text, but the actual spirit of Naneferkaptah himself, still present in his tomb alongside the preserved bodies of his wife and son, and the ghost proceeds to tell Setna the story of how he too once sought and obtained the same forbidden book, and how that acquisition led, through a cascading sequence of magical retribution, to the deaths of his entire family and eventually himself. The book itself finally sealed away with him specifically to prevent anyone else from repeating his mistake. Setna, undeterred by this warning delivered directly by the very ghost meant to embody its consequences, takes the book anyway, and the remainder of the tale describes the mounting supernatural punishment that follows, hallucinations, public humiliation, and a slow unraveling of his fortune and reputation, until he finally relents, returns the book to the tomb, and performs the proper rites to lay Naneferkaptah's family to rest. The story closes not with triumphant resolution, but with a kind of chastened, uneasy peace, knowledge deliberately unacquired, forbidden power returned to its grave, the implication left standing that some categories of understanding are simply not meant for the living, regardless of how thoroughly one might wish to obtain them. What makes this text particularly interesting to modern researchers is the window it offers into how the Egyptians themselves, at least by this later period, understood the moral architecture surrounding sacred and magical knowledge, a framework that treats curiosity itself as potentially dangerous, that imagines the dead not as passive keepers of secrets, but as active guardians willing to enact genuinely severe punishment against those who disturb what has been deliberately sealed away. The text offers no clear account of what precisely made the Book of Thoth so dangerous beyond the vague assertion of its power, no detailed theology explaining why knowledge of animal speech and command over nature should carry such severe consequences. It simply insists, through the recursive structure of its own narrative, that the tomb had been right to guard it, and that the living, however scholarly, however well-intentioned, are better served leaving certain doors permanently closed. There is a period in Egyptian history spanning roughly the 17th and 16th centuries before the Common Era, during which a foreign dynasty known as the Hyksos ruled over a significant portion of northern Egypt from their capital at Avaris, and this period, though attested clearly enough in the archaeological record, through distinctive pottery styles, architectural remains, and eventual military campaigns to expel these rulers, remains almost entirely unexplained in the Egyptians' own surviving textual tradition, leaving modern historians to reconstruct its actual character largely through inference and material evidence rather than direct testimony. Later Egyptian sources, composed centuries after the Hyksos were finally driven out, describe their original arrival and rule in language of vivid, almost apocalyptic hostility, as an invasion of foreign barbarians who seized the country without provocation, burned cities, and ruled with casual, contemptuous cruelty, a portrayal preserved most fully in fragments of the Egyptian priest Manetho's history, itself surviving only through quotations in considerably later Greek and Jewish sources. And yet the archaeological evidence from Avaris itself tells a rather different, more complicated story, revealing a genuinely mixed population, Egyptian and Levantine cultural practices existing side by side, trade networks that appear to have flourished rather than collapsed, and no clear evidence of the sudden, violent conquest later tradition insists upon. This gap between later Egyptian memory and the physical evidence recovered from the period itself raises a genuinely unresolved historical question whether the Hyksos period represented the traumatic foreign invasion later Egyptian sources describe with such vivid hostility, or whether it instead reflected a more gradual process of Levantine migration and settlement, culminating eventually in a genuine political takeover that later Egyptian memory, writing from the perspective of the dynasty that eventually expelled these rulers and needed to justify its own restoration of native rule, reshaped retroactively into a narrative of foreign occupation and heroic native resistance, considerably starker than the underlying reality may have actually been. What makes this particular historical silence so unsettling is not any single terrifying text, but rather the recognition it forces upon careful researchers that even a civilization as prolifically documented as ancient Egypt could pass through more than a century of its own history, leaving behind almost no contemporary account of how that period was actually experienced by the people living through it, and that the account eventually settled upon, the one that survived into later tradition, and shaped how the Egyptians themselves came to remember this era, may have been constructed, deliberately and considerably after the fact, to serve the political needs of whoever held power once the dust of that uncertain century had finally settled. On the island of Sihel, near the first cataract of the Nile at Aswan, stands a large granite boulder inscribed with a lengthy text known to modern scholars as the Famine Stela, presenting itself as a decree issued by the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Djoser, describing a famine of catastrophic, almost incomprehensible severity that gripped Egypt for 7 consecutive years, during which the Nile failed to flood, the seeds withered in the fields, and the population, the text states with unusual bluntness for Egyptian royal inscriptions, was reduced to such desperation that children were said to have been eaten by their own parents. The historical puzzle at the center of this text is considerable, because despite its claim to date from the reign of Djoser, roughly the 27th century before the Common Era, the actual style of the inscription, the specific vocabulary and grammatical forms used throughout, indicate quite clearly that the text was actually composed more than 2,000 years later, during the Ptolemaic period, presented as an ancient decree but almost certainly written considerably after the fact, as part of a dispute over land and religious authority between the priesthood of the god Khnum and a rival religious establishment. This raises a genuinely uncomfortable question that the text itself, naturally, offers no help in resolving. Was the 7-year famine it describes drawn from some genuine ancient historical memory, perhaps a real climatic catastrophe from Egypt's earliest recorded history, preserved across 2 millennia through channels of oral or ritual tradition invisible to us today, and finally set down in writing by scribes serving an entirely different political purpose? Or was the famine itself an invention, a piece of calculated religious propaganda, using the imagined suffering of a distant ancestral generation to lend weight and legitimacy to a contemporary Ptolemaic-era land grant, the horror of starving, desperate ancestor deployed as a rhetorical tool in service of an entirely mundane administrative dispute? Either reading carries its own particular unease. If the famine is a genuine ancient memory, then it represents a catastrophe so severe that its trauma persisted, in some recognizable form, across more than 2,000 years of Egyptian cultural memory, finally finding written expression only when a specific political need arose to give it voice. If the famine is instead a later invention, then we are left with the considerably stranger fact that a Ptolemaic-era Egyptian scribe, writing more than 2 millennia after the events he claimed to describe, felt no hesitation in fabricating an account of mass starvation and implied cannibalism among his own distant ancestors, confident that such an image would carry sufficient emotional and rhetorical weight to settle a contemporary religious dispute, a confidence that suggests the fear of famine and its ultimate horror, the collapse of the most basic human bonds under sufficient desperation, remained a genuinely potent and immediately recognizable anxiety throughout the entire span of Egyptian civilization. Real or invented, ancient or recent, equally capable of unsettling an audience separated from the supposed events by more than 2,000 years. Composed, most scholars believe, during the early Middle Kingdom, though set dramatically in the much earlier reign of the Old Kingdom pharaoh Sneferu, the prophecy of Nefertiti presents itself as an account of a court seer summoned to entertain a bored king with tales of the future, and what he delivers instead is a lengthy, escalating vision of catastrophe, foreign invasion, social collapse, and cosmic disorder that mirrors in striking and probably deliberate ways the language and imagery of the admonitions of Ipuwer we discussed earlier. Nefertiti describes a future Egypt overrun by Asiatic peoples from the east, the Nile running dry, the sun obscured and giving no clear light even at midday, the natural order of the seasons disrupted entirely, and a period of such total political fragmentation that the text describes a country divided against itself, brother turning against brother, a land, in the text's own vivid phrase, that fights against itself while men sit idly by watching it happen, too demoralized or too fractured to intervene. The vision culminates, however, unlike the unresolved fragmentary ending of Ipuwer's lament, in a clear and specific act of restoration, the arrival of a king named Ammit, understood by nearly all scholars as a poetic reference to Amenemhat I, the actual founder of the 12th dynasty, and the genuine historical ruler under whom this text was almost certainly composed. This structure reveals something genuinely important about how the Egyptians used the imagery of catastrophe and terror within their own literary tradition, not merely to document remembered trauma, as the famine stela and Ipuwer's admonitions may partially do, but as a deliberate rhetorical strategy, painting the darkest possible vision of disorder, specifically in order to make the actual, contemporary political reality, the reign of the ruler under whom the text was composed, appear as its necessary and welcome resolution. The terror in this text is not accidental or incidental. It is a carefully constructed literary instrument, and its vividness, the drying Nile, the darkened sun, the fratricidal collapse of the social order, was calibrated with real craft to make its intended audience feel, by contrast, a genuine and immediate gratitude for the stability of their own moment. And yet knowing this rhetorical purpose does not fully dissolve the unease the text still carries, because the specific images Nefertiti reaches for again and again, across multiple independent Egyptian sources composed across many centuries, dried rivers, darkened skies, brother against brother, suggest a shared cultural vocabulary of catastrophe that these texts drew upon repeatedly, a vocabulary whose origins likely trace back to genuine historical memories of Egypt's periodic collapses into fragmentation and crisis, memories that had, by the time these later literary texts were composed, become detached from any single specific historical event and transformed instead into a kind of permanent, available symbolic language for describing the fragility that Egyptian civilization, for all its monumental confidence, seems to have always understood lay just beneath the surface of its own apparent permanence. Between the era of the pyramid texts, reserved originally for royalty alone, and the later, more widely distributed Book of the Dead, available in principle to any Egyptian who could afford the services of a skilled scribe, there existed an intermediate body of funerary literature that scholars call the coffin texts, painted directly onto the interior surfaces of wooden coffins belonging primarily to Egypt's nobility and officials during the Middle Kingdom. And among the many spells contained within this tradition, a recurring, deeply anxious theme emerges with striking consistency: the fear not of ordinary death, which the entire Egyptian funerary system was elaborately designed to manage and overcome, but of a second, final death, a total, irreversible annihilation that could occur even after a person had already died and been properly buried. This second death, as the coffin texts describe it, was not guaranteed to happen to everyone, but represented instead a genuine, ongoing risk that continued long after the funeral itself had concluded, a risk that required active, ongoing ritual protection to avoid. The spells describe numerous mechanisms by which this final annihilation might occur, the deceased's name being forgotten or deliberately erased by the living, severing the crucial link between the physical body and the surviving spirit that depended on that name for its continued existence, the deceased's body being destroyed or improperly preserved, denying the spirit its necessary physical anchor, or the deceased simply being consumed, in the underworld itself, by hostile entities who fed specifically on the spirits of the dead who had failed to secure adequate protection. Numerous individual spells within this tradition are dedicated entirely to preventing precisely this outcome, formulas titled, in their original headings, spells for not dying a second time, or spells for not being eaten by a serpent in the realm of the dead, or spells for preventing a man's heart from being taken from him in the god's domain. The sheer number and variety of these protective spells suggests an anxiety of genuinely significant proportion, a fear that death itself, rather than representing a single decisive transition, was better understood as the beginning of an extended, ongoing vulnerability, one that could stretch on indefinitely, requiring constant vigilance, constant renewed protection, with failure at any point along that extended journey resulting not in some intermediate purgatorial state but in total, final, irreversible non-existence. What makes this material genuinely unsettling to modern readers is the recognition that the elaborate confidence of Egyptian funerary architecture, the massive stone tombs, the careful mummification, the vast wealth poured into ensuring a comfortable eternal existence sat directly alongside and was in fact explicitly designed as a direct response to a pervasive and apparently quite genuine anxiety that none of these preparations, however thorough, could ever fully guarantee safety. The dead in this worldview were not simply resting peacefully in a secured eternal state. They were engaged indefinitely in an active ongoing struggle against a very real possibility of total erasure, a struggle whose ultimate outcome, for any individual spirit, the surviving texts never definitively confirm, leaving each buried Egyptian suspended, as far as the historical record can tell us, in a permanent and never fully resolved state of both hope and genuine, structurally embedded dread. We should pause now, near the end of our long journey through this material, on a category of text that resists narration almost entirely, the substantial body of Egyptian religious and magical writing that survives today only in a damaged, fragmentary, or partially illegible state. Papyri eaten through by insects or moisture across 3,000 years of storage. Inscriptions worn smooth by wind-blown sand. Texts copied by ancient scribes who themselves appear, on close philological examination, to have misunderstood or garbled portions of considerably older source material they were transcribing without full comprehension. Conservators and papyrologists working today in museum basements and university laboratories around the world continue to piece together these fragments, sometimes literally, matching torn edges of the same original document recovered from different archaeological contexts, decades apart, sometimes held in entirely different countries, reunited only through careful comparative analysis of handwriting, papyrus fiber patterns, and content. And in a meaningful number of these reconstructions, what emerges, even after this painstaking work, is a text that remains genuinely, permanently incomplete, missing lines, missing entire sections, containing words whose exact meaning has been lost because they appear nowhere else in the surviving Egyptian textual record, hapax legomena. In the language of philology, words used only once, in a context too damaged to allow confident interpretation. Among these incomplete texts are several that clearly belong to the broader category of material we have explored this evening. Fragmentary spells referencing entities whose names survive but whose full description has been lost. Ritual instructions that break off mid-sentence at precisely the moment they might have explained the specific danger being addressed. Narrative fragments describing encounters with beings in the underworld whose ultimate resolution, whether triumphant or catastrophic, simply does not survive in any recovered portion of the text. These fragments occupy a genuinely unique category of historical unease, because they represent not silence in the sense of the Egyptians deliberately choosing not to record something, as we have seen elsewhere this evening, but a different, more accidental kind of loss. Information that clearly once existed, that Egyptian scribes considered important enough to carefully copy and preserve, but which the simple, indifferent passage of time has partially erased before modern scholarship arrived to make sense of it. Egyptologists continue to hope and continue to search for additional fragments that might one day complete these damaged texts. New papyri emerging from ongoing excavations, or forgotten pieces rediscovered in the storage collections of museums that have not fully cataloged their 19th and early 20th century acquisitions. But for now, and quite possibly permanently, a genuine portion of what the ancient Egyptians understood, feared, and attempted to ritually manage within the darker corners of their cosmology remains suspended in this particular, frustrating state, close enough to be seen, close enough to tantalize, but not quite close enough to be fully confidently understood. Painted across the walls of royal tombs throughout the New Kingdom, most completely preserved in the burial chamber of Thutmose III, is a text known as the Amduat, meaning literally that which is in the underworld, a detailed hour-by-hour account of the sun god's nightly journey through the 12 divisions of darkness that separate sunset from sunrise. Unlike the more devotional, formulaic tone of many funerary spells, the Amduat reads almost like a technical field guide to the underworld's geography, each hour illustrated with careful, almost diagrammatic precision, showing the specific beings, obstacles, and transformations the sun god must pass through before emerging renewed into the following day. Several of these hours describe encounters that remain genuinely difficult for modern readers to sit with comfortably. The fifth hour depicts a mysterious cavern called the Cavern of Sukkar, guarded by serpents and populated by beings rendered without clear faces, existing in a state the accompanying text describes as neither fully alive nor fully dead, suspended in a condition Egyptologists have struggled to translate satisfactorily into any single English concept, something closer to potential existence, held in permanent unresolved suspension. The seventh hour depicts the ongoing battle against Apophis, described here in imagery even more visceral than the Bremner-Rind papyrus, the serpent bound in chains, cut into pieces by attendant deities and yet, crucially, never described as finally permanently destroyed, only temporarily subdued, ready. The text implies to reconstitute and threaten the sun's passage again on the following night, in an endless, unresolved cycle of violence that the text presents not as an anomaly but as the fundamental, ongoing operating condition of the cosmos itself. What deepens the unease of this material is the specific claim the Amduat makes about its own purpose and audience. The text explicitly states, in its concluding sections, that knowledge of these hours, memorized and correctly understood, would grant benefit to whoever possessed such knowledge in the afterlife, suggesting the text was not merely descriptive, cataloging a journey the sun god undertook independent of human concern, but genuinely instructive, meant to be studied and internalized by the deceased king, or by later private individuals who gained access to versions of the text as a kind of essential preparation for a journey they themselves would eventually need to undertake, through the same caverns, past the same faceless beings, alongside the same endlessly recurring, never fully resolved battle against total unmaking. This transforms the Amduat from a piece of removed cosmological description into something considerably more personally unsettling, a detailed map of a landscape the reader was expected to eventually traverse themselves, populated by dangers that the text itself acknowledges are never permanently resolved, only endlessly, exhaustingly managed night after night for as long as the sun continues to rise, which is to say, within the logic of the text's own worldview, for as long as existence itself continues at all. Held today in the Egyptian Museum of Turin, badly damaged during its transport to Europe in the early 19th century, is a papyrus document that once contained what would have been, had it survived intact, one of the single most valuable historical documents from the entire ancient world, a comprehensive list of Egyptian rulers stretching back, in the document's own account, to a period before recorded human history, when the text claims Egypt was ruled directly by gods, and then by a subsequent line of semi-divine spirits, before finally transitioning into the recognizable, historical dynasties that modern Egyptology has spent 2 centuries carefully reconstructing. The papyrus unfortunately did not survive its journey to Europe intact. It arrived already fragmented, and further damage occurred during its early handling, before conservators fully understood the delicacy of the material, leaving modern scholars with a document torn into more than 160 individual pieces, many of which have been painstakingly reassembled over the past 2 centuries, though a meaningful percentage of the original text remains permanently lost, existing today only as blank gaps in an otherwise continuous chronological record. Entire reigns reduced to nothing more than a fragment of a royal name, or, in some cases, nothing at all, simply an absence where a ruler's name and regnal length once stood. These gaps carry a particular kind of historical weight precisely because of what surrounds them. A document that otherwise represents the single most systematic, comprehensive attempt by the ancient Egyptians themselves to record their own complete history, compiled, scholars believe, during the 19th dynasty by scribes with access to considerably older source material that has not itself survived independently. Where the list is intact, it offers extraordinary, otherwise unavailable detail, precise regnal years for rulers whose existence is barely attested anywhere else in the archaeological record. Where it is damaged, it offers nothing at all, leaving modern chronologies of certain periods, particularly the more obscure stretches of Egypt's earliest dynastic history and portions of the fragmented intermediate periods, built on inference, cross-referencing with other fragmentary sources, and in places genuine acknowledged uncertainty about which rulers reigned in which order, for how long, and in some cases, whether certain named rulers preserved elsewhere in fragmentary form belong to this chronology at all. There is something particularly haunting about a document that so clearly once contained the answer to questions modern scholars continue to debate, sitting physically present in a museum case, its damaged fragments carefully mounted and preserved, offering tantalizing certainty in some sections and complete, permanent silence in others, the exact boundary between what is known and what is lost visible quite literally, as a torn and irregular edge in ancient brittle papyrus, a physical, tangible representation of the precise, uncomfortable limit of what the historical record allows us to actually know. We have moved across these many hours through several thousand years of Egyptian writing, from the blue-green hymn painted into the deepest chamber beneath Unus's pyramid, describing a king devouring the gods themselves, through the smashed clay figurines buried with their careful bureaucratic curses, through the crouching, patient hunger of Ammit beside her scale, through a god who nearly drowned humanity in its own blood and was stopped only by the accident of intoxicated sleep, through a serpent bound and cut apart every single night without ever being finally destroyed, through laments of social collapse that trail off into damaged, unresolved fragments, through letters addressed to the dead by the living who feared them, through ordinary village anxieties about restless spirits disturbing an evening's sleep, through the deliberate, engineered forgetting of an entire pharaoh's reign, through a story about a book so dangerous that even a ghost, speaking from within his own tomb, could not adequately warn a curious prince away from it, through a famine possibly remembered and possibly invented, through a prophecy of catastrophe deployed in service of political flattery, through a persistent, structurally embedded fear that even a properly buried death might not be final, through torn fragments that will likely never be fully restored, through a nightly cosmic journey whose dangers are never permanently resolved, and through a king list whose most valuable answers exist today only as blank space where papyrus fiber has simply crumbled away. What connects all of this material across such an immense span of time and such varied genres of writing, royal hymn, bureaucratic curse, funerary spell, personal letter, court literature, historical chronicle, is not any single coherent theology of fear that modern scholarship has been able to fully reconstruct, but rather a consistent, recurring pattern of the Egyptians themselves reaching the edge of what they were willing, or able, to fully articulate and choosing, again and again, across dynasties and genres and centuries, to gesture toward the darkness rather than describe it completely, to name the threat without explaining its full mechanism, to record the ritual without preserving the specific historical anxiety that first demanded it. Perhaps this was intentional, a civilization that understood, on some level, that certain categories of dread lose their power when fully explained, that the crouching, waiting shape of Ammit is more genuinely unsettling, described only in silhouette than it would be with every detail of her feeding fully catalogued. Or perhaps it reflects something considerably more mundane, the simple, practical limits of what any civilization, however long-lived, however prolifically documented, can actually preserve across the genuine violence of time, insects and moisture and looting, and the sheer arithmetic of millennia working steadily against the survival of any fragile written record, regardless of how carefully its original authors intended it to endure. We are left, in the end, exactly where we began, standing at the mouth of a tomb in the last hour before sunset, close enough to touch walls covered in words we can, in a technical sense, read, and yet still separated by a gulf that 4 centuries of dedicated scholarship has narrowed but never fully closed, from the actual lived experience of fear, reverence, and uncertainty that first compelled someone, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, to pick up a brush or a chisel or a reed pen and commit these things to permanence. The desert wind continues to move across the Valley of the Kings tonight, exactly as it has for longer than any single human civilization has yet endured, carrying its fine, patient dust across cliff faces that are still, however slowly, however imperceptibly, continuing to crack and shift and fall. Somewhere beneath that ongoing, indifferent erosion, there may yet be more texts waiting, more fragments of whatever the Egyptians understood about the darker architecture of their cosmos, still sealed in chambers no modern excavation has yet reached. Whether they would answer the questions this evening has left standing, or whether they would simply deepen them further, remains, appropriately, entirely unknown.